And so the whole point is that do we have the rule of law or do we have the rule of men? And so in the case of Scripture and religious things, spiritual things, the Bible is ultimate, not the interpretations of men. In other words, we're all responsible before God to know what Scripture says and to live according to God. We can't really blame the pastor. And the same thing is true of the Constitution. The Constitution's ultimate. We can't really blame the Supreme Court. Right? Because we keep electing guys who put those guys on the Supreme Court. But the problem is we don't know what the Constitution says anymore. We talked briefly also about the Republican form of government, what it meant to be a Republican form of government, right? That we elect representatives who represent us, and that it's actually under law, under a Constitution, and that they hold their terms of office for a short period of time. In other words, we get to have a mini revolution every 2 years. I bring this one up because there was an interesting debate at the time of the Constitution about who should be able to be in office. And there were certainly those who believed that the only people qualified for public office, and it should be written into law, that the only people who would be qualified are people who are Christians. Okay? And yet other people who were also very strong Christians held the opposite view. So I had these two quotations here because I wanted to show that contrast. Okay? And so Mr. Henry Abbott has one view, and you can have some sympathy with that view. Right? And then James Iredell also has another view. And the difference really between the two is that Iredell believes that we don't have to enshrine it in law. He believes that the people will never really elect one of these people that Abbott was afraid of. Okay? And so, can you see the problem with both men's arguments? Right? What would happen if we had enshrined in law that you had to be a believer to hold office?
No questions of orthodoxy.
Yeah, you have all the questions of orthodoxy. Who is a believer? Who is a true believer? Right? What doctrines do they have to hold to in order to be qualified to run?
You also have, I don't remember who it was, but one of these founders in one of these debates said, well, such a requirement would not stop the truly the man with no scruples, so he'll just say whatever he has to.
Right. And so you would have people, somebody recently was talking about the fact that in Southeast Asia we had the problem after the problems in Cambodia several years ago of what came to be known as Rice Bowl Christians, right? People who claimed to be Christians so that they could be fed by the missions organizations. So you would have the same thing. You would have political Christians, people who would claim to be Christian so that they could run for office, right? And ultimately there's no way for us to tell the nature of a man's heart.
Did you say Cambodia?
Okay? Yeah.
Goes back further.
So
China.
30s, yeah. So, but you also see the problem that Iredell had, and that is that we are in fact electing people who he could not have conceived that we would have elected to office. Okay? And so it does set up an interesting dilemma, right? Interesting question. And so the ultimate answer really has to be with the people themselves, right? So, when we look for leaders, right, God's already told us what to look for in leaders. He told the people back in Moses' day what to look for in leaders in terms of what their requirements ought to be. Able men, first of all, they got to be capable, men who fear God, who are trustworthy and hate a bribe. And hate a bribe. Isn't that interesting? Okay? And then you have, interestingly, I find Paul does this quite frequently. Paul reaches back into the Old Testament and he expands on it for the purposes of a Gentile people, right? To say, here's what the qualifications ought to be for elders in the church. And if you look at it, it really is nothing more than an expansion of what Moses said in Exodus 18. Okay? It's written to Instead of a people like Israel, right, who had the law of God, it was written to a people who did not have the law of God.
When Saul was installed as king, and even when it talks about it in, I think, Deuteronomy 17 there, or 18, where it says these are the requirements of a king, there were two things said. Number one is, here's the king you put over yourselves, and then here's the king I'm putting over yourselves. So how does God do that when he's not speaking through prophets today? And I think maybe this is it. How do we know the man God has chosen for an office, the one that most aligns to this requirement? That would be the guy that God is choosing to put over us. Right. And if we acknowledge that and recognize that by our vote, then good things happen.
Well, there used to be a notion of vox populi, vox dei. Voice of the people is the voice of God. And I don't believe that was meant to be a pagan saying. In other words, just simply to say democracy wins out. I think that's what they believed about that. Okay? That it was God speaking through the people that would raise up the people, the men that God would have. Okay? And to some extent you can actually see this also in Israel, okay, in the kings.
It also reminds me of our discussion way back in the beginning about the men who were faithful with the talents.
Yep.
They got pressed into civil service. I went through and read the book of Daniel from that perspective, and it was very insightful.
And so, when we look for, and this is one of the things, one of the big things about presidential elections, right, over the last several years has been, what have we been told are the chief requirements for, especially for the office of president?
Got to be 35.
No, we haven't been told that.
U.S. citizen.
That is one of the requirements.
Natural-born citizen.
Yeah, but I'm asking about what are we being told are the requirements?
Smart.
Has to be smart, right? Has to be intelligent. Has to have gone to the right schools, right?
Speaker.
Has to speak well in front of people. Can't have a 5 o'clock shadow when he's on TV, right?
Has to have at least 2 or 3 teleprompters.
Right. And what happens whenever somebody wants to talk about that individual's character?
Not important.
It's not important.
Yeah, character doesn't matter, right? As long as he's got the right ideas, we don't care what he does. And I don't know if you've been paying attention this week about the guy from the IMF.
Yeah.
Right?
He was a character, all right.
Well, but you have to understand something. His behavior is acceptable in Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, his wife this week said, I don't care who else he seduces as long as he seduces me. I expect a good politician to be seducing other women. You have to understand, that is the expectation on the continent of Europe,
And the White
especially in
House.
France.
Well, Europeans are so much more
Okay.
advanced than we are.
So, in some sense, he's not a real man if he's not got a few affairs going on the outside. And you understand that we're very close to that same place. Because right now today we have one political party which holds to that value, and thank God we still have one political party that when somebody gets into those kinds of straits, they still have the decency to resign in shame. But that's going to go away. Okay? So just realize that we need to be the people who hold our elected officials to that standard. We need to expect them to be men of character. And the other thing is we have to be careful we don't go the other direction. That all we want are Christians who are incompetent. All right?
It starts with able men.
And one of the people that kind of, I'll be the first to confess this. I got duped in this in 1978. And I voted for Jimmy Carter.
I voted in 76.
Or 76, I guess it was, yeah. See, it's been too long ago. And I voted for Jimmy Carter.
Well, nobody's perfect.
And the only time I've ever voted for a Democrat in my life. But I bought into the fact the guy was a believer. At the time, he was certainly appeared to be more orthodox than he has become known as in the last 20 years. But he was a man who, as president, was totally incompetent.
Well, wait a second. They're pulling the same stunt. He was a useful idiot for the Democrats who wanted to get a tremendous amount of, they're doing Jimmy Carter too, you've seen the pattern over again, and
So,
so I don't see Jimmy Carter as being as incompetent as he was led to be. How's that?
I see him as worse.
It
Okay.
speaks of his character that he was led.
So, but the point being, right, that we have to be careful and we need to know something about these individuals, all right? And so to our credit, we do ask the people resign when they show that they